What's happening, everybody? Thanks for tuning into another episode of the Crash Bang Boom podcast. Today's guest is live session studio whiz, Mike and Ace, producer and more, and drummer Blair Sinta. Blair has worked with the likes of Chris Cornell, Stevie Nicks, Annie Lennox, Alanis Morissette, Melissa Etheridge, and more. And we get into Mike and drums, having a producer's ear, some of the lessons learned in working with some of the aforementioned artists, and a whole lot more. So I hope y'all enjoy the convo. Blair also has some courses up on his site, including Introduction to Recording, which focuses on minimal mic setups to record drums and a whole lot more. So check it out if recording drums is of interest. Crash Bang Boom Podcast can be found on iTunes Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Luminary, Google Play, Podbean, Amazon Music, Podcasts, and more. Feel free to check out any of the previous 200 plus episodes. Give me a like, a subscription, and or a positive review. The support is appreciated. Shout out to my perpetual sponsor, New Orleans Record Press. If you're looking to release some vinyl, hit them up at NewOrleansRecordPress.com to check out all the electroplating, mastering, design, packaging, and more, as even vinyl coloring options. And if you need help with the design, they can even hook you up with that. They also have a real-time quote generator to add it all up and keep tabs on it all. And they print 12 and 7-inch records in 150 and 180 gram variants and do small runs of 100 and larger runs up into the thousands. So hit them up, and that's NewOrleansRecordPress.com. So here we go. Blair Sinta. Get your production ears on. Crash, bang, boom.
Crowds go mad with joy.
Yeah! All right, I'm here with drummer Blair Sinta, who's worked with the likes of Chris Cornell, Stevie Nicks, Melissa Etheridge, Alanis Morissette, Annie Lennox, and more. Blair, thanks for hanging. How are you, my man?
I am doing well. I'm roasting today in LA. It's we're gonna have 105 today here.
Yeah, I'm over in Utah in Salt Lake City, and it's going to be 105 here as well with like 5% humidity. There's no humidity, so it's super dry. But at a certain point, once you get over 100 degrees, the asphalt heats up to the extent that it just stays in the ether, and you feel like you're breathing it. You know, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, you just hide.
Exactly. Stay inside in the AC.
Yeah, so all the better reason to sit in your studio and play drums and practice or whatever.
Exactly, man. Well, I'm psyched to talk to you because I dig your sense of production. I know via your website, Patreon, etc., all the things that you post on Instagram and more. I kind of dig your sense of production and the sort of tone-chasing mentality that I feel like you have with both kits, you know, acoustically, as well as experimentation with mics and some of the stuff that you offer with, you know, introduction recording to improving your groove and mic placement and production in general. So to start off with, well, we'll certainly get into that. But as far as 2020, as someone who has a pretty good setup from as far as I can tell. And by the way, is that in your house? Most of the videos that I see, is that your studio?
Yeah, I have a detached garage, which I converted, moved here about 12 years ago. And one of the first things I did when I moved in here was soundproof this garage so I could be out here all hours of the night if need be. And just make sure I could bunker down and make sound.
Nice. Did you do like the floated spring floor? Did you go super crazy, or is it just like a lot of sheetrock and a lot of insulation?
I didn't do the floor because the floor was cement already, so I didn't feel like it was going to escape from there. But I did do a room within a room, more or less, because neighbors in LA are pretty close, and I wanted to make sure that was never an issue.
Right.
So yeah, I did the room within a room, and sure enough, when everything's closed up, if you stand 10 feet outside my studio, you would not know I could play as loud as I can, and you would barely hear it. So
nice.
It worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Where in LA are you? Yeah. I'm not super familiar with LA. I've been to a few of the neighborhoods. I know downtown, but where are you in LA? I know it's so spread out there.
Yeah, I'm in Glendale, which is kind of the northeast area of. Well, I mean, I guess it's all relative, but yeah, northeast, between like Burbank and Pasadena, just north of Silver Lake.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Nice, man. Well, how was 2020 for you with your everything set up in your house? I mean, did you find that it was actually a pretty busy year for you with everybody kind of working on records during that downtime from touring and everything else?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. You know, I was working normally, everything shut down, and then I started to get a lot of phone calls from drummer friends who all of a sudden were at home and could use some advice on recording. So so that started to happen. I started to do a lot of kind of, answering phone calls and consulting for different people just on gear and just, minimal setups and things like that, which actually led me to kind of take some of my Patreon courses and turn it into a course for sale, which is the introduction to recording.
Right.
And then for me personally, work-wise, things like exploded for a couple months. Everybody was home. Everybody wanted to just keep making music, people that were on the road, and they were just starved to be creative. So things kind of went nuts for a while. And then things slowed down, but definitely I feel like between people being stuck at home and then getting stimulus money, it was interesting to watch from my perspective. And I got to say, I was never happier to have already had a foot in the door with home studio recording.
Absolutely.
It's kind of pointed me in a direction in the past year that I was already going down, but I've gone down even harder. The education part of it, because it's, this is where we're at. The big studios, there's some left, and those studios are incredible rooms, and I love being in those rooms. But the reality is, people need to be able to record themselves, and drums are very complicated, to record. Yeah. So, I love talking about it. I love, it's what I spend my days doing. And then the idea of, teaching people and helping them get better doing it, it's a process I enjoy.
Nice. What was the process like pulling all of that recording gear together for your studio? And I guess ultimately, did you have a pretty good idea of what you wanted, having taken notes from doing studio work with bigger studios? Or once you got into your place, it's still a room, there's still drums, there's still mic placement. It's always going to be a little experimental, but did you kind of have a good idea of what you wanted even initially, just as a foundation for recording yourself?
Well, for me, it was a very long process. The first type of home recording thing I bought was back in 2000.
Wow.
I bought a Digio 1, which was 2 mic pre's and a Mac, iMac. So that's where I started in Pro Tools. I think it was called Pro Tools Lite back then, or Pro Tools LE. So that was my introduction. And it really wasn't about recording drums at that time for me. It was learning how to write songs, and drums were actually totally secondary. In fact, I think I made like a 7-song EP, and I played guitar and I sang and I wrote everything. And I actually think I went to a friend's house back then to record drums.
Right.
But I started, doing a little producing for friends, just kind of dabbling in that. And then, I lived in a place that was like a guest house, so I couldn't really make noise. So I started recording like little, almost like Beach Boys type percussion things for tracks and things like that. So that was kind of my introduction. And then I had a house in Burbank before I lived in Glendale, and that's when I built my first studio out. And that's when my gear collections really started in earnest. So that was early 2000s. I was, it was like, oh, I need another 2 mic pre's. I'll buy that. Oh, it'd be nice to have some mics that work on toms. Okay, I'll get those. Ooh, look at that compressor. That's, I've been told that's a good compressor. I'm going to get that. eBay was big back then, and vintage gear was not as expensive as it is now back then. So a lot of it was going to studios, seeing stuff, and then having friends that were also in a similar position, not necessarily drummers, but starting to buy gear. And I would really get advice from them on what to buy. So my process of buying gear was probably a decade.
Wow.
I was just never in a hurry. And I really am happy it went like that, because I think the idea of, buying a whole bunch of gear and setting up 12 microphones is pretty overwhelming.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I like about one of the courses that you offer is sort of simplifying mic setup and, determining whether or not, and you should be able to, if you get it right, given the time, that you can record yourself maybe with 4 mics. I know that I've been doing it. I have a little studio set up here downstairs, and I've just been doing it with a room mic, a bass drum mic, and a 57 on the snare, and just kind of adding a little oomph, so to speak, with the bass drum and the snare, and ultimately just kind of depending on the room mic and trying to play semi-dynamically. That's something I kind of struggle with a little bit, but I've found that it is definitely doable. So at some point, I have a couple of overhead mics. I need to get the mic stands, and then I can start doing maybe the 4 mic thing. But tell me a little bit about going from the 12 mics down to the 4, and sort of what you realized about what you can get away with, maybe particular mics and or particular mic setups.
Yeah, so I definitely like I just said, I kind of, bought gear over time and just, like most people, I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, all right, snare mic, kick mic, mono overhead and a room or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then at a certain point, I had talked to an engineer friend and I was talking to him about like, well, how do you learn to like get sounds, and I was thinking like full production at the time.
Right.
And he said, well, get your friends together and see if you can like do whatever you can to like recreate like a Rolling Stones tune. See if you can get it to sound like the Stones.
Yeah.
It's like, okay. And I was like, well, I never actually did that, but that kind of planted the seed in my head where, I knew the story of like when the Levee Breaks.
Yeah.
And I knew that was done with 2 microphones.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, I'm going to try to get that sound in my room. I'm going to get as close as I can to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's only 2 microphones, I should be able to get pretty close.
Right.
I had already been recording a lot. For like years, but I was kind of afraid of EQ. I didn't really understand compression that much,
Mm-hmm.
but I was doing tracks for people and most people were very happy with it, but oftentimes it's kind of over compressing the room mics and, cause it's fun. That sounds good,
Yeah.
but it's not necessarily appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
But at a certain point I was like, okay, I'm going to do this Bonham thing and see if I can get it. And the more I got into it, I was like, okay, it's only 2 microphones. The room size has to be a certain amount. So you gotta fake that. You gotta figure out how to fake that.
Mm-hmm.
But then it really just came down to tuning. And then of course, trying to capture, my imitation of John Bonham.
Right.
So I spent a week doing that and just really trying to like tweak and work on EQ. And all of a sudden your ears start to open up. You're like, oh, it should do this,
Mm-hmm.
like these need to do this. So that was kind of like when I started to get much deeper into it. And then it just kind of spiraled from there. I was like, oh, I'm going to try to get this sound. Oh, I'm going to try to get this sound. And then eventually, DW made me like a Phil Collins kit. And like, I was like, yeah, I'm going to try to do this, like I'm going to try to get like In the Air Tonight. And, like,
Oh, wow.
See if I can do this at home.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just incredibly eye-opening because I was just cranking high-end EQ on the toms. And I was like, it still doesn't sound right. I'll keep going. And finally it's like, oh, that sounds pretty close. So like my brain started to process EQ and things like that. So to really go down that road of just imitating sounds, just like you would learning how to play drums, like, oh, I want to try to sound like Tony Williams, or I want to try to sound like John Bonham, or I want to try to sound like Al Jackson or something. You know what I mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, you got to listen really closely and you got to experiment and you got to record yourself and you got to be critical. It's a pretty similar process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's cool hearing you talk about that whole process because it definitely is a process. I was going to be amazed if you were like, yeah, got everything, knew exactly what I wanted, nailed it first time around, been sticking to that. And then you're like, well, I got it 20 years ago. So clearly it's changed a little bit. But
yeah,
I dig the idea of starting with getting your kit to sound good. And if you have a semi-dynamic sense that ultimately the mics are just capturing the sounds that are naturally happening. I like that you've kind of driven that idea home. That's because it all starts with the kit anyway, if that's what you're going for, right? The acoustic kit.
Well, it doesn't make, I mean, if you think about it the other way, you can't have a wide open jazzy bebop kit and hope that it's going to sit in a disco track,
right?
Like a Bee Gees track. Like, it doesn't matter what microphones you put on it, right? It's like, no, the drums sound the way they sound.
Mm-hmm.
People are like, oh, what mic pre's are those? I'm like, it's not the mic pre's.
Yeah.
It's the drums.
Yeah.
It's the drums and the drummer,
right,
you know?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I think you've mentioned it as well. I mean, on those old Motown records and a lot of that stuff, that was minimal miking. And I mean, those kits sound awesome. And it's certainly the players and everything in between rooms. You call it what you want. But, I mean, that could be at times an entire band playing with a really fine-tuned dynamic sense and minimal miking per player. And those records sound incredible.
Yeah. To this day, no one's worried about how many microphones were on those kits. Like,
right.
You don't listen to a James Brown record. You don't listen to Clyde Stubblefield and go, how many microphones were on Clyde Stubblefield? You just go, no.
Yeah.
It sounds dope.
Absolutely. Are there any particular bands whose records have been inspiring to you? I know you mentioned a few there, a few players, everybody from Clyde Stubblefield to John Bonham or Bee Gees record or to Tony Williams, et cetera. But were there any producers necessarily or any bands, productions sort of as a whole that really were inspiring to you?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like never ending.
Right.
We kind of traded some emails, and Spoon is definitely a band that like I'm always inspired by because their production is so refined.
It's so good.
Yeah, it's so good, and they're really thought out on what they put into a song, and it's almost like they have a template. They're like, oh, we're only going to use. I'm making this up, but I'm like, it's almost like they go like, we're going to use 8 instruments to make this song. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what it is. Like, there's no like, oh, let's just randomly put this thing in here.
No,
just because like I saw it on the ground. It's very like thought out, but man, there's so many. I mean, I love to listen to like hip hop records, even stuff that's programmed and my brain like spins like, how could I make that acoustically? How could I recreate that sound with acoustic drums?
Sure.
Queens of the Stone Age always has incredible drum sounds. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, it's like anything, it's like there are vibes that are created and I'm always analyzing like, well, how did they do that?
Yeah.
And I'm at a pretty good point of like being able to think critically through like, okay, I hear this element. Oh, they combine those two things. Mm-hmm. And then there's this thing. And I think I know what that is. I got to say those Queens of the Stone Age records, though, the last couple are pretty mystifying to me. I had no idea what's happening in those, but they sound really cool.
They do sound really good. Absolutely. Yeah, that's funny. You said Spoon. I as well have been, since I started kind of picking up and trying to do like solo electronic music, I started listening more for like production and just sort of trying to pick out what was happening, what was going on. And yeah, like the Spoon stuff, it's interesting as well because, I mean, you have like the more beautiful side, like a song like Inside Out or more dance tracks like Hot Thoughts off that last record, or like the earlier stuff is like more like kind of Rolling Stones, esque tracks off of like the Ga record, and they're all amazing. Right. And all a little different from each other, but I think the production is really well thought out. All the playing is great, the songs are great, and as I mentioned, Britt Daniel as a vocalist, you don't get many people that have natural raspiness, a little natural distortion in their voice, and that guy's got it for days. He's so good.
Yeah. Yeah, just like the cool factor with them is just very high.
Totally.
I like it. But the record that like really blew me away was Kill the Moonlight, which I think was 2003. Mm-hmm. Like the opening track only has a tambourine as far as percussion, but like when it comes in, it's like so loud, and I'm like, oh, it's super effective. Like that, whatever they did there. And then their use of like a drum sound combined with a percussion element. Mm-hmm. And it's not just like, oh, we're going to bring it in on the chorus. It's like where they decide to use it to give the song motion where they feel like it needs to move forward more. Right. I think it's just like really smart,
Totally, man. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as far as some of the ones that I've been sort of obsessing over, and I don't know if you collect vinyl or not. It's one of those things where I was like, I should have never even started this because in hindsight, I can't even imagine how much money I've spent on that. In addition to like drum gear and everything else, it's like, did I really need like one more outlet to be throwing money at all the time? Mm-hmm. But when AC/DC hooked up with Mutt Lange, who I always want to call Butch Vig and vice versa, I just constantly conflate their two names as producers with singular syllabic names. I just love the way that in working with him, AC/DC sound changed, and then the drums just were more prominent. The guitar sort of sat in a different place, and the production kind of just became this different thing. Definitely interesting compared to the earlier ones where, as one of my producer friends said, that he always loved the raw, like all the tubes about to explode in an amp sound for some of the previous records, and it would have been super cool to find a balance between those super raw guitars and the way the drums were produced with Mutt Lange. But definitely interesting to think about that. But in any case, I mean, between Highway to Hell, Back in Black, and For Those About to Rock, all three of those records, I just kind of listen to them interchangeably, honestly.
Right.
Always love the ELO records because I love Jeff Lynne as a vocalist, songwriter, and producer, and then Spoon as well. So I've been on that's kind of been the holy trinity lately. I've been like ELO, AC/DC, and Spoon. It's quite a trinity.
Yeah, Jeff Lynne definitely is, man, just awesome. Yeah, for sure. And of course the Mutt Lange thing was like huge for Back in Black, you know. And, you know, the other thing that's always interesting to me is like, you know, the whole guitar tones versus drum tones thing. And like, sometimes you think something is really big, like a drum sound, but in reality, it's the sound of everything else. And sometimes the drums actually are quite small when you start to analyze them. You're like, oh, wait a minute. I'm not saying DC drums sound small.
Mm-hmm.
There are some records where you're like, oh, that's not as big as what I think it is. I just like the rhythm is popping out.
Right.
It's not sort of the sound. Yeah.
Right. Well, as far as some of the artists that you work with, I mentioned some of them earlier. I'm sure you've had no shortage of little lessons or realizations along the way in working with them, but are there any in particular that you look back on and think, you know what, that was a very like crucial lesson, and it could be as subtle as just, you know, dynamics or anything, groove, whatever it is. Is there anything that kind of pops up in your mind as a key lesson along the way? And I'm sure, like I said, there were a few. And I wanted to also say, I love it that you worked with Stevie Nicks. She's one of my all-time favorite vocalists. I love her so much. Her and Chris Cornell are like two of my absolute favorite vocalists. But in any case.
There's three things I'm thinking about in particular. So
okay.
One, the first time I worked with Glenn Ballard, it was actually technically the second time, but the first time was just one song and it was kind of in and out. But first time I made a record with Glenn Ballard, who, if anybody doesn't know him, he produced Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill. Mm-hmm. And then when I was part of Alanis's band, we recorded an album called Jagged Little Pill Acoustic. And so we remade Jagged Little Pill, but all acoustic drums and guitars and things like that. Mm-hmm. But the first day we were going to record with Glenn, the idea was like, hey, we're not going to play these songs exactly like the Jagged Little Pill record, because why would you remake it? It's like, so like, what's your take on it? You know, and we're gonna, you know, it's kind of like an open collaboration of like, you know, feel free to like expand on these tunes, you know. So he asked me what groove I was gonna play for this tune, and I was playing brushes, and I just started playing the groove, and he just kept sitting there, standing in front of me, and he was bobbing his head a bit, and I just kept thinking, don't play anything else. Don't play a fill. Don't do anything. Don't fuck this up.
Right.
It lasted about 3 minutes, and I just played that. And then I think he finally stopped me. He was like, okay, cool. You know, and I was just like, cool. You know, I knew he wasn't looking for me to like solo or impress him. You know what I mean? I think he was probably singing the song in his head or something, you know, he just wanted to hear the foundation. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I kind of, in my mind, I was kind of like, don't do anything else. I think it was really important in that moment. Because I think had I thought, oh, I got to play some fancy shit right now to like impress him, that may not have gone over well for me being on the rest of that record, you know?
Yeah.
So that was cool. Another time I was, again, recording, Glenn was producing, and we were recording with Annie Lennox. Again, this was like a month-long process of recording a record with her.
Wow.
But we'd played, I don't know, a handful of takes of this tune, and we're all standing in the control room, and she was listening, and then she just started to like dance, like, you know, like if you ever seen Annie Lennox, like in a video or whatever, all of a sudden it was like Annie Lennox like dancing, and I was like, oh, that's what we're going for. You know what I mean? Like, and
totally.
It was like and the beat was like the, you know, boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, you know, just that. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, that's the beat that's connecting with her, you know? And I actually went back and listened to some rhythmic stuff, and a lot of it is 4 on the floor. Mm-hmm. And she really likes the 4 on the floor thing. And I was like, oh, okay, that's your cue, dude. Like, that's what you need to be doing, like, on this record. That's what she's listening for to connect with, you know, as far as the groove.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so one last thing, since you mentioned Stevie Nicks, I ended up on one song on the Stevie Nicks record, but I played on like 3 or 4. It was kind of like a revolving door of drummers on that record. Mm-hmm. But I did some early demos. Steve Ferroni ended up on the real track, but I did the demo of it. Oh, wow. But when I started playing the tune, and then her vocal came through the headphones, the groove in her vocal was so incredible. It like had a pocket. And I was like, oh, damn. I don't think I had ever played, she wasn't there, so it was just her voice. So I don't think I had ever played with a vocalist that had that kind of groove.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, you lock into the vocal here. That's what this is about. Like, you're locking into the vocal. So that was pretty cool. Like, that was like, oh man, this is part of why she's such a badass.
Right.
It was just all laid out in the vocal,
Wow. I believe it. Yeah, she's got great phrasing, always has. I mean, that's just, I'm such a fan of her voice, lyrics, songwriting, phrasing, all of it. That's awesome. It's a great story. All three of them.
Yeah, just where she laid down her phrasing on the beat, like the feel, it was just all right in there.
Nice. Man, one of the courses that you offer is like how to improve your groove, and it's something that I am not so great at doing, nor reminding myself about it, despite multiple tries. Which is sort of breathing, being conscious of how I'm breathing while I'm playing, because my tendency is to hold my breath and not even like really even get some good breaths in before I even start. Like if it's even a long set. So I was just curious if you had any sort of insights into sort of breath and making that work while you're playing.
Interesting. What's funny is I actually haven't released that course, so maybe you're forcing me to put it out.
Nice.
Because it's basically done. One of the things I've always battled with is not sitting up straight. So It used to be slouching forward. And it's something I still have to consciously think about.
Me too.
And then it became like leaning to my left side.
Yep, me too.
Yep. And I actually had a very interesting thing this past week because of being on the computer too much. I went and got some acupuncture in my right forearm, and I've never had tendonitis from playing. I've never had an issue. But this was like flaring up, and it was really uncomfortable. So I went to get acupuncture. I will get back to breathing. Hang on.
Yeah.
I went and got acupuncture, and the woman who was doing it, I was also telling her, I have like my left shoulder in the back, like my upper back, is very tight and things like that. And she said, oh, stand up. So she looked at me and she goes, look, you're out of balance. Like, look at your right shoulder. It's lower than your left. And I was like, ooh, okay. I mean, it was pretty subtle, but I was like, oh, okay. And then she goes, take off your shoes. I was like, okay. And then she looks at my right foot, my arch. And she goes, look, your arch has collapsed in your right foot.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, oh, yeah. I'm like, oh, wow, crazy. And sure enough, she gave me some exercises that I'm like doing every night and when I wake up in the morning. And I swear I practiced earlier this morning that all of a sudden I'm sitting up straighter, just naturally. And the way my foot feels on the pedal is like a totally different thing. And it's the ergonomics of playing drums and breathing is like, it's so important. It's crazy,
Yeah. Yeah.
So to get back to your question, I've never been like a breath holder in that sense, but I think everything that we do, one thing, man, I'm going to try to wrap this all in.
Yeah.
One thing I used to run a lot. I don't run so much anymore, but I used to run a lot. And I always used to run and try to run in time with my breath, like 3 steps, I'm breathing in, 4 steps, I'm breathing out, 3 steps, I'm breathing in. And then when I would get winded, I would switch it like, okay, 2 and 4 or something like that. So I was always thinking about that kind of stuff. I think the super long-winded route to what you're asking is everything that we do playing-wise is just incredibly important. Being relaxed, not holding tension in our body, especially in our hands.
Yeah.
Sitting up straight is so important especially for long-term health, and just breathing. So hopefully your playing reflects that.
Yeah.
Because your personality is reflected in your playing, and your playing is reflected by your personality.
Sure.
I think.
Of course.
So whatever you're physiologically putting out at the kit comes out in your sound and in your groove and in the attitude of what you're playing. So there's a non-answer of answer for you.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's all intertwined for sure. And I mean, I myself, once again, like I literally, it's pretty much the same. And my posture hasn't always been the best. I tried to correct it. Then I noticed from taking a drum lesson when playing double bass, my buddy was like, "You're leaning to one side." So I was trying to straighten that out. And then from years just trying to get the double bass down is like taught me a good bit about actually sort of centering myself and keeping my posture and my breath. That is an interesting thing that I would say, even if people are looking to not necessarily play within the context of music, but working on double bass and evening out both sides of your body, because you're so accustomed to different voicings. And even though the actions of the pedals of a hi-hat and a bass drum pedal are different, and then the voicing is different, and then when you try to just solidify both of those, it's like it's a process. I'm still working on it, man. That's the funny thing about double bass, that it's been helping me through that, a little bit of that, I think.
I totally agree with that. I actually pulled out, like, I've had a double kick pedal sitting in my studio for like ages, and I finally pulled it out. Like, well, not to get into the story, but I had a funny call about possibly auditioning for somebody, and there was some double bass stuff involved, and I was like, "Ooh, I better get on this," you know?
Yeah.
But what I realized, exactly what you're saying, is when I started to do it, one, to get it sound even, I had to sit up straight.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, because especially being able to kind of, quote unquote, jump on and off the bike, you know, you got to be balanced.
Totally.
You can't lean to one side.
Yeah.
So I've kept it up. I keep it up. I hardly use it, but I do work on little like Jim Keltnery type grooves with it in that context. And I think it's a great tool for learning how to sit up straight.
Yeah. Definitely. Now, as far as the breathing, though, it's funny. You were talking about your personalities reflected in your playing. I'm like, sometimes my playing, especially after I did some playthroughs of some drumless tracks that I have, and then when I watched the video, I was like, I look like I'm grimacing in my face at times, and I look kind of uncomfortable, and I realize I'm holding my breath, and I was like, well, if that's the case, if I'm sort of conveying how I physiologically or mentally, emotionally feel at that time, I must be one neurotic fuck, because it certainly sounds like I'm kind of playing that way as well. My God, I need to calm down.
Wow. Well, I can't comment on that, but it might be an astute observation. So.
Yeah, man. Oh my God. Well, as far as again, kind of going back to your website, I know that maybe you said you hadn't put out the Improving Your Groove one, but we talked a little bit on sort of the introductory recording techniques. What are some of the other ones that you have on there? Because I feel like you have a few, no?
No, it's just those two: Introduction to Recording, and then there's a one called this Introduction to Recording Amplified. It's got a few more lessons in it.
Gotcha.
And then Improve Your Groove, which I'm going to put out soon. And then I'm working on a concept of actual, I guess what you would call them, live master classes, Zoom style,
nice.
that I'm going to most likely be doing in the fall. And that'll be like a kind of a series that you'll be able to sign up for. And I'm working on that right now. I'm working on the whole concept right now, but I'm hoping to probably start that in late August or September. And that'll be for people who are really interested in recording drums and getting deep. And it'll be probably like a 6-month course or something like that. Every couple of weeks, there'll be a Zoom class on different topics. Yeah.
Awesome. That sounds really cool, man.
Yeah.
When setting up your kits and it looks like you've got a good bit of drums, is there any particular combination? I have 3 kits down here with probably 8 snare drums, a bunch of different cymbals, and I have another kit on the way that's being built for me right now. So I'll have no shortage of kits to sort of swap out for different sounds. But is there one in particular when setting it up that either acoustically or through mics? I know, again, it's probably hard for you to separate the two because you're kind of thinking about all of that. But is there one combination which you especially dig of the kits that you have?
I wouldn't say one over another. You know, for me, it's all like vibes.
Totally.
The funny thing is I've gotten to a point where things don't sound bad to me. They just have a vibe,
right.
You know? So there's nothing that, you know, people are like, oh, that kit sounds like shit or whatever. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It does this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I mean, and you know, I pretty much change my kits out like almost daily, just depending on the music that I'm recording.
Yeah.
And like, they're all about different combinations. So it's like, I need that bass drum sound. I'm picking that kick drum. You know, I need that snare sound. It's probably one of these 3, you know, cymbals, you know, it's all about that. So I have this might be embarrassing. Let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bass drums in here.
Damn, dude.
Yeah. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of toms and about 25 snare drums and I don't know how many cymbals. So,
oh, wow.
It's, I'm just thinking, I'm always thinking about vibe and tones. I don't want to say I think in colors because that sounds like, it sounds like it sounds right. But for me, it's just about like, what is each drum giving me to sit into a track the way it should, and give the track the character that it should have.
Right.
I don't care what the combination of drums is, whether they're like, I have one vintage rack tom and like a single-headed concert tom, floor tom, and an 18-inch bass drum or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, if that's the thing that gets me there, cool. Like, totally. I don't really care.
Absolutely. Well, it's always easier to probably narrow this down, despite what sounds like you have 25 snares. Is there one in particular that you feel as though works in a lot of different applications and is pretty diverse? Because I've got a couple of those in particular.
I see where you're going here.
Yeah.
I have a Drum Paradise snare drum, which was made by Chris Hewer, who's a guy here in LA. And they call it, it's called the Hitmaker. Sometimes you can find them online.
Wow.
It's really just I believe it's a World Max shell with die-cast hoops. Yeah. Tube lugs. And that drum, it does a lot. So that one probably gets used the most. Because it sounds great high and wide open. It sounds great low and super dead. It's got a great touch. So it gets used a lot.
Gotcha, man.
Yeah. My new favorite snare is this DW carbon fiber, which is just like crazy. It's like, it's really dry. It just has a very unique sound the way it sits in tracks. So I'm kind of fascinated by that drum right now.
I didn't even ask you, man. How long have you been playing drums?
36 years or so.
You got me by 6 years.
Okay.
I've been 30 for me. Yeah. I'm about to turn 45 and I got my first kit when I was 15. Technically I was playing in like school band prior to that, but as far as playing a drum set, I got my first kit when I turned 15. So yeah, it's been 30 years for me as well. Seems like a hell of a long time, doesn't it?
It doesn't seem like it. It is.
Because that's exactly what it is, right?
Yeah.
Oh man. Once you started playing, do you remember your first show that you ever played?
I'll put a little technicality in it. I think the thing that actually sent me on my path was I was playing drums and I really loved it. But so my father was a director at the Interlochen National Music Camp, which was up in northern Michigan. So I was up there for a summer and I think I was 10, must have been 10 or 11. But there was a high school kid. There was a high school jazz band, and I would go watch that band practice. I was kind of fascinated by it. In fact, one of the drummers in that band was Clarence Penn, believe it or not. So, do you know Clarence Penn?
I don't know that I do.
Okay, Clarence is an incredible jazz drummer. He's played with like, I don't want to blow his credits. He's played with like Betty Carter and Wynton and all kinds of. I mean, he's a seriously heavy cat.
Nice.
But Clarence was one of the drummers in that high school jazz band. But there was another guy. And he just kind of was like super cool to me. I would come and watch and I would, sit next to him while he played and, whatever. But then there was a concert and there was a tune where he was playing congas and he said, hey, why don't you come up and, play one of the congas with me? And I was like, okay. And they got the approval from the director. And there was a moment where there was like trading fours and Clarence was playing kit and me and this other guy were playing congas. And that was like the most exciting moment of my life at that time. I was like, whoa. And I got home and I was just like, holy shit, that was like amazing.
Wow.
And like, I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, this is what I'm doing.
Right. That's awesome, man. When do you feel, I guess, in your playing, did you sort of get the curiosity on the studio production side of it? Was that sort of more recent or was that, I don't know, when did that sort of start?
So, yeah, I think I was always curious about it without really knowing it. One of the things that I found difficult when I was learning how to play jazz, when I was at college, was I had like a Yamaha like rock tour kit or something, like a super fusion-y kit. and I was trying to play straight ahead jazz with like a, 22 by 18 kick drum and a, 10-inch power tom and things like that.
Yeah.
And I was always like, man, I just suck at jazz. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
And then when I actually got to LA and I got a gig, like a Sunday night gig down at this place called Fifth Street Dicks, and there was a kit down there, and it was just like a, I don't know what it was. I don't even remember. It was like a, vintage Ludwig kit, like 12, 14, 20. And it was cranked up and it was tuned like how it was supposed to be, sound for like traditional jazz.
Totally.
And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I actually know how to do this and I sound pretty good. The thing that started to dawn on me was, it wasn't that I didn't know how to do it then. It's that the sounds that were coming back at me when I was learning how to play they didn't sound like the records that I was listening to.
Absolutely.
So, like, in my mind, I was like, I kind of suck at this. Like, I'm not that good.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, I think if I had heard those tones coming back at me, it might have helped my self-confidence and just being like, oh, right, okay, I'm doing this right. I'm creating those tones,
Mm-hmm.
So that was always there. I was always curious about that Alex Van Halen snare sound when I was young.
Right.
I was like, oh, how do you get that? And I was always trying to tape up my drum. I would watch the video, like a concert video, and be like, his drum looks like this. I wonder if I do that, it'll sound like that. You know? So there was always some curiosity around it. But then, when I started recording more seriously in LA, my peers I was recording with, especially guitar players and keyboard players, I had so much like envy of like, when somebody had a pedal board, how they could just completely change the vibe of what they're doing, in an instant with the press of a pedal. And I was always like, man, I wish I could do that with my drums.
Yeah. Right.
So about the time that like, I that would be in my mid to late 20s, that's when I think my fascination with like drum sounds and production and things started to kick in.
Right. And so you moved to LA from Michigan?
No, I went from Michigan to Texas, and I spent 4 years at the University of North Texas. 5 years, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I came to LA from there.
That school cranks out a lot of great drummers.
It certainly does. Yep. The guys that were there when I was there, it's pretty awesome. Yeah.
Who were some of the guys? Because I spoke to Aaron Cummins of the Spinning Doctors, and that was the same thing he told me. It was just like there were so many drummers that were coming through there at the time. Who was there when you were there?
Keith Carlock, Rich Redmond, Jason Sutter.
Yep.
A lot of guys that are not necessarily, totally named guys either.
Mm-hmm.
They're just incredible players. Earl Harvin is great. Earl lives in Berlin now, and he's played with like Seal, and
wow.
He's on a bunch of recordings that, like Sam Smith and everything. And Earl's incredible. Who else? A guy named Rob Efsharian, who I studied with, who lives back in Michigan, he's just one of the most incredible stylistic drummers.
Nice.
I'm going to blank and like offend a bunch of people, but like,
Sure.
Ari Honig was there.
Oh, nice.
It was just, you name it. There was just a lot of guys that turned out to be pretty heavyweights,
Right. I know this could be probably its own podcast, but what do you attribute that the drummers coming out of that program to being so good coming out of that? I guess what is it about that curriculum and or the teachers and or just the whole setup? Is it kind of like a pretty strong drum centric program? I guess with great teachers. I don't know too much about it on the teacher or faculty side of it.
Right. I think it's a combination of things. One, it's just had a reputation. And so, first of all, that just attracted a lot of, not just drummers, but musicians, because the level of musicianship there, I'm assuming still, I can only imagine still,
right,
was just very high, My teacher was Ed Sof, so Ed was definitely an attraction, a really tough teacher, but just, I think, a really important, kind of mentor for a lot of drummers, just in his teaching style, because his thing was never about molding guys to sound a certain way. It was about molding them to find out who they were.
Wow.
As a drummer, so like, it's not like I'm going to go in and get the same as an 18-year-old, as Keith Carlock, right?
Right.
Because Keith was always like miles ahead of everybody. So, he's not like, okay, open your book to page 21 and blah, 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 do this. You know what I mean? Of course there was that because it's a school and you have to have a curriculum.
Right.
But Ed was able to because Ed played at such a high level, he was able to take a player like me and a player like somebody like Keith and do the same thing without teaching like a cookie cutter thing.
Right. Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, and I just think the vibe of Denton, Texas at that time, which was kind of this little weird hippie town in the middle of nowhere, in the early 90s, it was, I guess, eclectic would be a good word. It was super eclectic. There were like rock bands, there were funk bands, there were people jamming, like there were, little cafes, people playing jazz all the time. There were top 40 bands if you were going to gig down in Dallas.
Right.
So it was just, I think that whole school attracted, and again, I'm assuming it's the same now, but it just attracted people that wanted to play music and become good musicians.
Right.
So I can't say it's any one thing. Ed was definitely a certain flashpoint. The environment was a flashpoint, and then kids just getting there and just wanting to play music with other kids and creating.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've always been kind of curious about that. So when anyone mentions that, I always have to pry a little bit to just kind of get a sense of the environment there. Because again, I've just known so many amazing drummers that have come out of that school. So that's cool, man.
Yeah, it's a pretty special place. Yeah, totally.
Awesome, man. Well, what's going on with 2021, man? I mean, thankfully, like you said, it sounds like you've been etching away at this whole studio thing. You got that all squared away. No shortage of drums. So,
right.
Is it at this point? Is it just kind of working on the website and everything else, and getting lessons up, and just continue to crank away at sessions and all that?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I would definitely like to play out a little more.
Yeah, right.
I miss playing with people, and that's. I don't think it's good for anybody to do just one thing, like as even though, most of my work is studio work, it's incredibly important for me to keep making music with people, in whatever capacity that is. So, it's interesting because I'm giving more lessons almost with audio as opposed to drumming lessons. I was never like out to be like a drum teacher,
right?
But things have kind of turned that way. So I am giving drum lessons, but I'm also doing a lot of audio stuff.
Right.
I'm kind of like starting to now that COVID restrictions are lifting, I'm actually dropping into people's studios and helping them with in their rooms.
Nice.
Which is pretty fun. I would never have imagined that.
Yeah.
And just trying to be creative in my own way, and
Sure.
not just be like, oh, he put another thing on YouTube or whatever. I still wanted to have artistic value and fulfillment for my own self.
Hell yeah, absolutely, man. Right on.
Yeah.
Killer, man. Well, Blair, it was fun talking to you, man. I appreciate the time and sort of running me through all the drums, recording techniques, lessons, and just the whole sort of trajectory of playing drums for, I guess, 36 years. Is that what you said?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
more or less.
Exactly. Yeah,
still a long ass time, man.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you having me. I love talking about this stuff and spreading the word about where we're at in the industry. It's an interesting point we're at with music.
Definitely right on, man. Well, I appreciate it, and we'll catch up soon, Blair.
All right, thank you.
All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Blair for rapping. Definitely cool talking to him about all the miking techniques and certain drums and vibes and University of North Texas and all that good stuff. It's definitely a cool conversation. Now I got to get into one of those courses so I can up my game with miking these drums. We'll catch y'all in the next one. Crash, bang, boom.